Welcome to our podcast, Identity Dialogue. I'm your host, Nita Chaudhary. I'd like to welcome Alexander Carolyn to our podcast. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you, Nita. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So I just wanted to jump in with our little exercise that we have when we do our workshops on identity, where imagine a diagram where there's a circle in the middle, and that's you, Alexander. And around that are satellite circles that are descriptors or words or phrases that describe Alexander. And I wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about those little satellite circles and you, Alexander.
So there are different kinds of circles, I would say. I wouldn't have a particular order in which to put them, but I would start from very basic things like human being, man. I certainly feel European. That's definitely my cultural background and heritage. I certainly feel Jewish, although I'm not religious, and I am an absolute atheist, and I don't see that as a contradiction. I'm a father of two wonderful children, and that's definitely something that defines me. I'm a husband for 20 years now, and time flies. That's almost half of, it's half of my conscious life, I would say. So that's a lot of time. I don't have a one word to define this, which is what I do for living, and that's technology. And I did some software development professionally, and I would say inventor slash technologist, which is a way to define the different things that I've been doing for almost 30 years now for a living. And that is definitely part of what I am, of who I would, what I would identify with. And then obviously I have these mixed identities, national identities, because I was born in Russia when it was still Soviet Union. But I was actually born in what now is Russia, in Moscow. I grew up in Israel, a completely different place, a completely different culture. And I've been living in Italy for almost 20 years now. So these are the three nationalities that have contributed to my being. And obviously each and one of them has left something in me. To this or other degree. The funny thing is that, and I always say that I was born where I was born, so we don't choose a place of our birth. When I moved to Israel, I was a child. I was 14 years old. So although I was okay with that choice, I didn't make it. I chose to live in Italy. So this is the first place I have consciously decided I wanted to live my life in, and I think I'm incredibly lucky and fortunate to have had the opportunity to make such a choice, because most people do not have that possibility.
So I wanted to then follow actually from what you were saying, is that if there is a moment in which you were proud or happy with regards to one of those descriptors that you just gave to us, that you could share with us, a story that you could share with us.
So one thing certainly is incredibly close to my heart for very obvious reasons, and it's the birth of both my children. This is a very vivid memory for me, both of them, because it was, it's never a smooth ride, but it is a long-lasting memory. It is incredibly important. If I think about events in my life that have defined it, it's certainly the birth of my children. And although I was a mere spectator. It is still incredibly important for me. I also have this incredible memory of holding my daughter in my hands right after she was born for the first 30 to 40 minutes of her life. And that was an incredible experience that I feel has created a bond that is still there, and she's 11 years old. And it's inexplicable. It's something we still do not understand on any rational level, but it is incredibly strong. And this is certainly a memory as long as I am able to keep memories, this is a memory that I will certainly cherish and keep thinking about. It
So
was
your
a
identity,
defining moment. It was a defining moment for me, yes.
so your identity as a father, this transition moment of actually becoming a father was a very defining part of your identity.
Yes, absolutely. There is another moment I remember, which was actually uh, not not the moment my first child, my son, was born, but a few weeks before that. I remember waking up in the middle of the night with this thought that uh, he was going to arrive. I could do absolutely nothing. I'm going to become a father. I'm going to have a son. It's a completely different life. And, I cannot turn away from this. This is going to definitely happen. This is out of my control. I have to live with that. And it was, on the one hand, a scary thought because, um, again, we're talking about a human life. We're talking about somebody that comes into your life and you cannot just say no. It's not a friend. It's not a remote relative you can basically disconnect from. This is my son. And that thought was as frightening as it was exciting. It was both at the same time. That was the moment I think I realized finally what I was getting into, in a sense. But and I think for a man, for a male, it's a good thing to have that moment before your firstborn is actually there in front of you. But again, it was both scary and exciting. And I remember that moment. I remember waking up. It's a very, very a strong memory I have.
Wow.
And definitely it is something that has defined me.
Super. So I have another one about a moment or a story where you were less proud or maybe a little bit unhappy about one of your descriptors that you presented.
So I would say that right now we're in the middle of the situation in which I'm sometimes not so proud of having Russian heritage, not because of the heritage itself, but with because of what is being identified now with the Russian language and what Russia represents in the world right now. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all Russians are like that and Russia is only these things, but definitely there is some negative uh, charge now attached to it, and that's not a fun thing to have as as part of your identity. But I would tell a different story, which actually I find at least a little bit amusing. So having all these different national identities, let's put it that way. When I go abroad to Germany, France, US, wherever, I usually bump into my different co-nationals. So I may bump into Russians, I may bump into Israelis, I may bump into Italians. And actually, it's quite different. Russians tend to be quite suspicious of people who speak their language, especially now with the situation in Ukraine and whatnot. But even before that, there is this aura of wait a second, who are you? Where are you from? Why do you speak Russian? So that's quite a thing, and it's strange. And it's not uncommon. So sometimes you bump into some Russians that are looking for information, and you actually help them out, and they have this view of suspicion, saying, "It's strange. You speak Russian," and that happened to me quite a lot. Israelis, on the other hand, now Israel is a 9 million people country. So Hebrew is spoken by very few. It's just these people plus maybe a million more, if I want to be very generous. So a very, very, very small language. And if you meet Israelis abroad and you respond in Hebrew to them, the fun thing is that they're not surprised at all. So Russian is spoken by nearly 300 million people. If you put together all the ex-Soviet Union and whatnot, Hebrew is spoken by maybe 10 million. And still Russians are surprised to hear somebody speaking Russian, and Israelis take it for granted. And sometimes they're not happy to communicate. They don't care. They don't consider it a worthy opportunity to connect. And so it so happened to me to help some Israeli tourists to find a place to stay, because I knew a hotel, and I actually got them a room with a discount and said, "Oh, we'll think about it." So it's not always like that. Again, I did meet Israelis abroad, and we connected and whatnot. But most of the time, there is this reaction of, "Okay, business as usual." We're all over the place. Italians, however, and that happened a lot to me, tend to connect right away. And I actually got help a couple of times in some complicated situations in Germany from Italians, just because we could speak the same language. There was this immediate understanding, "Oh, you speak Italian, I speak Italian. Yes, of course, I will help you." And this is very striking, because I was not born in Italy. I don't have a very strong accent, but if somebody is born in Italy, they can hear something wrong with my Italian, obviously. I don't sound 100% authentic. So, but there is this understanding, and it's almost universal, that, okay, you need help, we'll help you. I need help, and you're helping me. Thank you very much. And this is something that I always found, to my liking, because you bump into someone, you need help, they need help. It's a good thing that you can connect, you can figure things out. You don't have to, to become family, to stay friends forever. It's a small transaction of, you show me where to go, or I show you how to fix your car, whatnot. But it's great to be able to rely on that. So I know that if I get into trouble, if I have some, existential issues, and I'm abroad, and I see an Italian restaurant, I can knock on the door, and most probably I'll get help.
So
I cannot.
So you really showed some important differences in how language connects people, and how language has made you connect with people, and the culture and the language has. Yeah, and I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how that Russian, Israeli, Italian, these different national identities has meant to you. And you've started that conversation, but I wondered if you could tell me a little bit what it's meant to you, having that.
Well, as I said in the opening, I feel quite lucky, quite fortunate to have had the opportunity to live in different countries and to travel even more. I'm not giving that for granted. This is something I own, not in the material sense, but in the sense of a collection of experiences that make up my personality. So it's a weird mixture, because Russia is basically an empire. It is a huge country. I have been to a very little tiny portion of it, because I grew up in Moscow, and obviously that part is a tiny part of the country. And I've been to a few other places, but I cannot say that I've traveled a lot in Russia. No, I've traveled much more in Europe, actually, in my entire life. But culturally, obviously, it had a huge impact because I've read a, a huge number of books in Russian. That was the first language I learned. It was the first language I read books in. So it is hugely impactful. And obviously, the Russian language has been the primary source for what has become my character, my understanding of the world in the first 15 years of my life. Israel has come as a blow because it's a completely different place. I've transitioned from a huge empire where you could travel for days and days and you wouldn't leave the country. You had time zones that span from 3 p.m. to midnight within one country. Sorry, from 2 p.m. to midnight. It's a huge scale to a country that is tiny. You can go from one end of the country to the other within a matter of hours. Okay. It's a tiny little place in the middle of huge conflict, lots of tensions that was trying to build itself up because in the beginning of the 90s, when I happened to be there, it was in the middle of the first Intifada with 1 million of ex-Soviet Jews arriving, and Israel was back then 6.5 or 7 million strong. So it has added 1 million of people, giving them shelter and food and help to find jobs and learn the language. An incredible feat. I've never seen anything like that in my life. And it was complicated, tough, rough, but it could have been much worse. So I was incredibly grateful, but it was a huge transformation because it was on the opposite side of the spectrum. It's a hot country with a hot climate, with very emotional people, with a completely different language, with a completely different culture or absence of culture as some perceived it, a different planet almost.
So actually, maybe you can tell me why your family went from Moscow to Israel.
So that happened to quite a lot of families. As I was saying, almost 1 million of Jews from the ex-Soviet Union moved to Israel in the 90s. And that was happening for two primary reasons. One was basically the anti-Semitism that was on the rise in the end of the 80s. And it was felt by many people, including my family. And the thinking on my mother's part was that she didn't want to risk me growing up in this environment because she did go through some not very pleasant experiences when she was graduating school and going into the university and so on and so forth, despite coming from a privileged family with some resources. So that was part of her thinking. And also you had some pretty bleak economic outlook, which is another reason for which people wanted to move somewhere else. Actually, economically, moving to Israel was not a very good call in most cases because we know that this is something, well, some people ended up earning so much money in the ex-Soviet Union that actually, if they moved to Israel, they would have earned maybe 1/10 of that, but they were lucky. So, but I do know some people that went to Israel and then came back to Russia and made lots of money. So I'm not 100% sure on the economic side of that, but people were afraid of being persecuted because Russia has a very long history of anti-Semitism. It's the birthplace of modern anti-Semitism. The Pale of Settlement, which was the principle according to which Jews could only live in certain parts of the empire, as well as some of the famous anti-Semitic works like I wrote this down, sorry. It's the Prodigals of the Elders of Zion, which was crafted by Russian secret police to provoke anti-Semitic riots all over Russia. And imagine this book is still being cited by some people in the West nowadays. And this is a complete fake. This is a not very well crafted piece of fake news from the 19th century. So Russia has its history, and it had waves of anti-Semitism that were pretty horrible. And one of these waves, part of my ancestors separated, and some of them went to the West and ended up in Switzerland. Some of them went back to Russia, ended up in Kazan. And these are two different branches of the family that have now reconnected in a sense. So all these stories come from the times when it was rampant in Russia, and we all have collective memory of that. So that's the reason, that's one of the reasons, main reasons why Russian Jews decided to leave Russia in the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s and move to Israel. Some of them went to Germany, the US, but the bulk of them went to Israel.
So it's actually interesting. I want to ask one question, but I want to actually refer to a conversation we had previously about these scripts and how on your recent trip to China, you were reflecting on these different scripts you've lived in and what this has actually meant to you about living in these various scripts. I wonder if you remember that conversation.
Yes. Yes, this is something that I realized being in Hong Kong a few weeks ago. I went for a walk in the evening, and I ended up in one of these alleys where you have small shops and all these different places. And looking around me, I knew where I was. It was not a problem of me losing, getting lost in Hong Kong. But looking around me, I saw only Chinese text. Everything was in Chinese. And no Latin, no nothing, just Chinese. And it was I had this very strong impression of being, this was me realizing I was in a completely foreign place, despite things looking pretty familiar. And so then I thought, well, I grew up in Russia where everything was in Cyrillic. You could go on for days and weeks without seeing any Latin around you because everything was in Russian and Cyrillic. Back in the Soviet times, you didn't have much tourism, so you didn't need to have any English subtitles, so to speak. And it was fine because I grew up in it. That was the script I was comfortable with. It was quite normal. And it didn't seem strange to me. It didn't seem exotic, although it was, because Cyrillic is as exotic as Chinese, as exotic as Latin. It depends on your perspective. So I was just getting the other side of it. So I grew up in some place that had Cyrillic, which is read and used by just a few languages. Maybe 400 million people, 350 million people use Cyrillic on a day-by-day basis. Chinese a little bit more common, but Hong Kong has traditional Chinese, which is used by several million people, maybe 60 to 70, because we have to include Taiwan in that. So it's a bit more rare, but Chinese in general is read by over 1 billion of people. It's a huge chunk of humanity that lives in that world. And it depends on our perspective. It's a question of where do you come from? So I also remember talking about scripts. When I started learning Italian, so first I learned Russian, then I learned English, and then I learned Hebrew. Each came with a different set of characters. When I started learning Italian, I said to myself, oh, I can finally reuse an alphabet. So again, what we see around us, we do interpret it. And if I end up in an alley in Hong Kong and it's all in Chinese around me, it seems foreign and strange and unknown. And it might even be scary. But it's not, because if I was born in Hong Kong, that would be absolutely natural to me. It's just the way that's who you are, that helps you have a different perspective on the same things.
So the language, do you feel like your identity morphs and changes depending on the language and the script you're living in? Do you feel like different aspects of your identity emerge?
So I think it's a mixture, because so on my computer now, I have 5 different keyboards available. It's in alphabetical order. It's Hebrew, French, English, Italian, and Russian. And I can sort of type without looking in 4 of these languages. So French is still complicated for me because of all the inverted letters, Q and A, W and Z. But and I move from one alphabet to the other, sometimes several times a day, because I have to write something to my wife, and then I have to write something in Italian. Sorry. And then I have to write an email in English. So I keep switching between languages, and sometimes it's tough, because when you're tired, switching between 3 languages may become a bit of a challenge. But these are all parts of me. I read news in different languages. I mean, it's natural for me, if there is a news piece in an Italian newspaper that says something about France, I would certainly try to look into Le Monde, because I want to see the primary source. And if I read a piece on Italy on CNN, I will certainly look for that in Italian, because I have this curiosity, because I think that we live in a world where, double checking information is extremely important. So so the languages I have learned, and I'm still learning, because you cannot definitely learn a language. You keep learning it, even if it's your mother tongue. They all contribute to my view of the world. When I was in Sweden this week, and some words in Swedish can be, well, sort of understood because of the English that and some come from French. So sometimes you look at some texts around you, and you do understand little bits and pieces of it, just because of all the different language that that you connect with. And obviously, when you learn a language, something that I have understood early on, when you learn a language, a little bit, you have to become like the people who speak that language, because the language reflects the culture. It reflects the being of these people. That's why American English is different from British English, because these are slightly different cultures. They are interconnected, but they are different, and these differences are reflected in the language. Same thing, if you learn German, you have to become a little bit German, because otherwise you're not going to understand it. You're not going to get into the right mindset to learn and use the language. You might be able to understand it, but you're not going to speak or express yourself in it, because you have to embrace these other bits of a different identity of sorts.
So I wanted to ask a question. As you can imagine, 2 of your countries are engaged currently in wars. And I wondered what this has meant for you and your identities, and how you've grappled with that. I wondered if you could help our listeners understand that.
So it is terribly painful, because war is painful. It's another kind of an event that you cannot stop. At least you and I, normal people, have no way of stopping it. This is something that we have to cope with. either directly if we're in the conflict zone, or indirectly because we have to live with this tragedy that is developing in front of our eyes. And any tragedy is, in the end, a tragedy. You cannot help but understand that human life is absolutely unique, be it a life of your friend or enemy, it is still unique. So it is terribly painful. There is also a huge difference between these two conflicts that you were talking about, because while I'm absolutely clear on the Russia's war in Ukraine and where I stand on that, and I stand with Ukraine because I am absolutely convinced that this is a useless criminal act by an autocratic regime that is looking to cover up its inability to build a decent place for its people to live in, against a country that is perhaps not the best of places in the world. It has corruption, has issues, but it was trying to find its way in building a different kind of society, a free society, and detaching itself for a very complicated and painful past that Ukraine has, because it was always part of different empires. It has developed its own discrete identity that is there, but they only had a chance to have a country in the 90s for the first time in their history. So, and I understand completely where I stand and who I stand with, and it's much, you know, the cut-off point for me is very clear. The situation in Israel is much more complicated because I absolutely do not align myself with the political powers that are currently governing Israel, which I absolutely disagree with on so many points. And their policies and their ideas are absolutely not mine. But on the other hand, we cannot expect anybody to leave the atrocities of the 7th of October unanswered. So
does that mean
I'm not.
But does that mean those 10, 12,000 people should die because of that?
No, this is not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say that this is a situation in which what happened on the 7th of October was a horrible tragedy. And obviously, I think to every reasonable person in the world, it is clear that Hamas is a terrorist organization that has committed horrible crimes. And that's something that we cannot detach ourselves from. And the second thing that I absolutely believe in is that Hamas must go. It's not the Palestinian people. It's not even an authentically recognizable or reasonable authority that could govern Palestinians. They have captured the power in a pseudo-civil war. They're not entirely legitimate by all means, and they have to go. I perhaps do not entirely align with the ways which the Israeli government has chosen to make Hamas go away. But I'm not in a position to judge anyone here because this is not my job. I'm not a professional soldier. I have very limited understanding in the military. What I do know is that IDF is not targeting children and civilians. This is absolutely impossible, and that's not how that organization works. They make mistakes like everybody else does. But there is a difference between targeting civilians in a terror attack and trying to get rid of a terrorist organization that is deeply rooted, unfortunately, in Gaza, and that keeps both Israelis and Palestinians as hostages. So this is a horrible, horrible tragedy. I do not have a solution to it. It is terribly painful. But obviously, I cannot accept any of the extreme positions. Not the position that says, let's kill them all, be it one side or the other, or whatever. And there is also the problem that we live in a world that is, there is this, I think it's Moses Naim that has made define this thing of the PPP world, the world of three Ps, the populism, post-truth, and polarization, where we always are attracted by the extremes instead of trying to bridge over the differences. And we also live in a world where the fake news, the incomplete information, the spinning is so potent. We keep falling, all of us, even the most educated people, keep falling in the pitfall of believing in something that is not worth believing in. There is a quote that I found in a book I'm reading right now, and it's a quote from 1991, and it's a quote from a conversation between two CIA people, one a senior officer and one entering the organization. Obviously, it's fiction, but the quote itself is very interesting. Sometimes I think our future existence will depend on whether we can keep false information from proliferating too rapidly. This is 1991, Hollywood's Ghost by Norman Mailer. And this is so true. This is what is happening now. We have to find a way altogether, the humanity, to make sure that false information stops proliferating. I don't know how to do that, but that would certainly help to prevent this polarization that is now creating so much havoc around the conflict and in the conflict itself, because we have to realize that people that are bearing arms on both sides now are fed by this misinformation.
And
This
also
information,
this notion of identity, they each have an identity, and whatever position you take, and I'm not going to state my position, but whatever position you take, it's based on identity and these notions of identity.
certainly, but I don't have to be automatically afraid or hate somebody because they're a Palestinian or Muslim. That's not part of my identity. My identity doesn't put me at odds with somebody that is from the other side of the green line of or the fence, whatever. That's not the point. And actually, I might be able to understand a Palestinian better than most Europeans because I have lived in that place. I have some more understanding of that nature. I do have some understanding of that mentality because it is also part of me, inevitably. Not to the degree it is a part of somebody who has lived all their life in Israel or Palestine, but I do understand a little bit of it. So it is just like different languages that I speak, it is also part of me. So why do I automatically have to make the assumption that if somebody is Palestinian, they are my foe? No, it's not automatic. If somebody says I'm a Hamas fighter, I would be a little bit afraid, yes, because to me these are criminals, just like a mafia man is a criminal to me, or any kind of criminal is not somebody I would like to spend my time with. Let's put it this way. So it's not the fact that somebody's Palestinian or Iranian, another country Israel has a little bit of beef with them. It's directly related to the conflict in Gaza because they're probably involved in it. Not probably, it's quite clear. That's not, the identity does not have to be generalized into, if you are that, if you have that identity, you're automatically my enemy. But the problem is that we are wired to think that way. And the more polarization takes over, the more we get led in our thinking, in our actions by the media and social media that feeds us this crap, pardon my French, the more things are going to be difficult, because it's so much harder to get over this mental block, this kind of internal limitation of saying, okay, you're potentially my foe because you come from the other side of the fence, but we can still talk. We can still try to discuss. And again, my personal history with being part of the Peace Now movement in Israel back in the 90s and attending meetings with Palestinian youth where we would spend hours on talking both about the conflict and our interests and our passions, that gave you the understanding of the human that you had on the other side. That told me that, this simplification we have, that I'm white, you're black, so we're enemies. Or I'm Christian and you're a Muslim, we're enemies. Or I'm Jewish and you're Muslim, we're enemies. It makes absolutely no sense. These are very easy to follow because there is simple white or black, red or green identity tags, but they're no good. These are fake perceptions, basically. And the only way to get over that is to try to bridge over the differences, try the dialogue, try to understand the other. When you do that, you suddenly realize that, it's not that frightening, it's not that horrible. I remember, again, it is connected to the birth of my son, seeing, so when he was born, maybe a couple of weeks later, it was, I think, half a year later, we were at a routine checkup in the hospital. And my son had curly blonde hair when he was little. And there was another child with very similar hair. And his parents were Arabs. I didn't know if Palestinians or Egyptians, it doesn't matter. They looked so similar. It was so funny. So it's probably a type of hair that is in our genes, because we do share a certain gene pool between us and the Arabs, and they looked similar, and they were actually communicating. And what's the problem? We are out of the zone of conflict. Nobody has to present their identity. Ours is not that visible. Theirs was a little bit more visible, but we didn't care, and everything is fine. So again, it's a question of perception. I see Chinese text around me. Oh, I'm scared, I'm lost. Or I see Chinese text around me and say, okay, I have Google Maps, I can find my way. I don't have to necessarily be afraid. It's a question of perception.
Thank you. I think that actually is a good kind of ending to how we should see our identity, but how we live with peace and dialogue and see the other. I think that was really a very enriching way to describe it. So thank you very much, Alexander, for taking the time with me. And we'll speak soon.
Thank you very much, Nita, for the opportunity.